Today, we're going to explore why certain behaviors, whether they're good habits or problem ones, seem to pick up steam and become almost unstoppable. We'll be using a concept from behavior analysis called behavioral momentum to really understand why some behaviors stick around while others just fade away.
Have you ever wondered about this? Why is it that a new gym habit can suddenly feel totally automatic, while at the same time, a child's tantrum might keep going long after you've stopped giving in? Well, the answer to both of these scenarios can be found in a really powerful concept from behavior analysis.
And that concept is called behavioral momentum. Now, it's important to note that this isn't a literal force, but it's a fantastic metaphor that helps us describe how sticky a behavior is. And that stickiness all comes down to its reinforcement history, basically how much it's been rewarded in the past.
To really get a handle on this, we're going to borrow a few simple ideas from the world of physics. It's actually a surprisingly helpful way to think about why we do the things we do.
First up is mass. In physics, an object with more mass has more inertia. It's harder to get moving, but it's also harder to stop. In behavior, a behavior's mass is its reinforcement history. So, the more a behavior has been reinforced over time, the more mass it has, and the more resistant it becomes to change.
Okay, next we have velocity. Velocity is just speed in a particular direction. When we're talking about behavior, velocity is simply the rate of responding. How fast or how often the behavior is happening right now.
And just like in physics, when you put mass and velocity together, you get momentum. So a behavior with a lot of mass, meaning a really rich history of reinforcement, that's also happening at a high velocity, is going to be incredibly difficult to stop. It's like a big, heavy flywheel. Once it really gets spinning, it takes a lot of effort to slow it down.
So let's just summarize this comparison to make it crystal clear. In our metaphor, mass is the reinforcement history, velocity is the response rate, and momentum itself represents the behavior's overall resistance to change. This gives us a really solid framework for talking about why behaviors persist.
All right, now that we have the metaphor down, let's connect it back to the science. How does this idea actually explain why some behaviors are just so persistent? Well, the technical term for this is response persistence. It's the tendency for a behavior to keep going even when the rewards stop or when the environment changes. You can think of it like a snowball rolling down a hill. It's going to keep rolling for a while even after the slope flattens out.
This concept is incredibly useful because it helps us predict how a behavior is going to hold up under pressure. It explains its resistance to extinction, that is, why it continues even after you remove the reinforcement. It explains its robustness to disruption, like why it continues despite a loud noise or a fire drill. And it even helps explain why behaviors used to avoid something unpleasant can be so hard to stop.
The great thing is, this isn't just theory. We can actually use the principles of behavioral momentum to our advantage with a very practical, hands-on strategy. It's called the High Probability Request Sequence, or HiP for short. The idea here is pretty simple. You build up behavioral momentum with a few easy wins before you introduce the more difficult task that you actually want to see happen. Here's how it works in practice. First, you ask for a couple of high-probability behaviors. These are things you're pretty sure the person will do, like clap your hands or touch your nose. As soon as they're in that rhythm of responding, you immediately follow up with the low-probability requests, like clean up your toys. You're using the momentum from those easy tasks to increase the odds of compliance with the harder one.
Think about starting a workout. You might begin with something easy and familiar, like jumping jacks. That initial movement builds momentum that can carry you right into something tougher, like burpees, because you're already in motion. The HiP sequence works in exactly the same way.
So, as we wrap up, there's one last crucial distinction we need to make. It's a really common point of confusion, and getting this right is key to truly understanding the concept.
It is so important to remember that behavioral momentum is a description, not a cause. It doesn't explain why a behavior happens, it just describes its persistence. So, instead of saying a behavior persists because of momentum, a much more accurate way to put it is that the behavior has a rich reinforcement history which makes it resistant to change.
Let's do a quick recap. First, behavioral momentum is a metaphor that describes a behavior's resistance to change. Second, a rich reinforcement history is what gives a behavior its mass. Third, this is why behaviors with high momentum persist through things like extinction and disruption. And finally, we can use the HiP sequence to strategically build this momentum for the outcomes we want.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to consider. Now that you understand how you can build momentum, how could you apply this idea? Think about a new, positive habit you want to start. What are the easy, high-P steps you could take first to build that initial momentum and carry you into the more challenging parts of your new routine? It's a powerful tool, and now you know how to use it.